All right, thanks to all three of you. Do you want to just come up for a few minutes in case there are any questions altogether? Sure. We're open to any questions.
Well, Lila, maybe all of you said that basically the problem with the Constitutional Convention is that the same forces that run the General Assembly control the convention. Why wouldn't that still, isn't there still a possibility that the Speaker's control over delegates to the convention is not as direct as it is over the representatives? Therefore, wouldn't there be more of a chance to enact some of those not beneficial to the legislature, whether it's line item veto or the Ethics Commission control? Isn't there still a better chance under a constitutional convention for those things to get through than there would be under the House of Representatives?
Thank you for the question. It needs to be clarified. I think what you neglected to take into consideration is that the delegates to the Constitutional Convention are elected from the same representative districts as the members of the General Assembly, as the members of the House of Representatives are elected from. And therefore, it has been true that since the person who represents that district is prohibited from serving in the Constitutional Convention, he or she most often will find someone to run who believes as he or she does and will follow the directions of that person. That is what we have found, that although the people for the delegates for the Constitutional Convention run without partisan labels, they still, since they run from representative districts, are beholden to those who control those districts. I hope I've made that plain.
I think the proof is in what happened in 1986. That's the answer to the question. No, there wasn't much of a difference at all. And certainly from a civil liberties perspective, and I think the perspective of some of these individuals, if it's going to be similar to the General Assembly and you're concerned about the General Assembly focuses on statutes. And they can create lots of problems with statute. A constitutional convention messes around with the most important legal document Rhode Island has, its Constitution, which cannot be changed again in 2 years. It's there for a very long time, so the stakes are much, much higher with a constitutional convention and what it can do versus what the General Assembly does.
Can you speak to what specifically are the minority rights that I've heard referenced in opposition to the Constitutional Convention? What kind of things could be put into a constitution that would affect minorities or women's right to choose?
Well, all we have to do is look at what happened in 1986. That's the best example. We know these aren't hypotheticals. We know that the 1986 convention put abortion at the top of its agenda. It passed not one, but 2 anti-abortion constitutional amendments. One of them was defeated after a very expensive and extensive campaign. One of them was passed because nothing on the ballot indicated that the question had anything to do with abortion. There were 2 other constitutional amendments that Roberto referred to that had a very direct impact on the rights of racial minorities. A drug bail amendment that took away the right to bail for innocent individuals charged with drug crimes, as well as a constitutional amendment that took away voting rights from thousands of people. And it took the General Assembly 20 years later to overturn that decision. So there were real consequences to individual rights as a result of the 1986 convention. If we see what's going on around the country these days, divisive social issues are now routinely put on the ballots elsewhere. Rhode Island really provided everybody an example of what to expect, and it's only gotten worse since 1986, with wealthy out-of-state interests now spending millions of dollars on these very divisive ballot campaigns.
So, what were the amendments that affected minority rights in '86?
Well, they had to do with people who were arrested for drug offenses and their ability to get bail. There was a disproportionate that bill disproportionately affected minorities. And now, the hot issue is voter ID, and I'm sure that there will be bills and a lot of discussion about voter ID, and probably to make it more difficult for people to vote if they don't carry an ID. So I think those issues are still around.
Any other questions?
It's because of the way it turns out. It is unnecessary. And we have estimates of everywhere from $1 million to $2 million to have a constitutional convention. Why should we do that when we have a General Assembly that's perfectly capable of initiating constitutional changes? We don't need this constitutional convention.
In order for the constitutional, when the delegates come together, it's required that there be a structure in place in order for there to be deliberation. And when you had, for example, 50 delegates, you had to find a way of doing that. Someone had to be the leader. There had to be leadership. And my sense is that the same dynamics that come into play in the General Assembly and in local councils and in the federal Congress come into play here. There's always a desire for power and authority and control, and so all those alliances begin to happen. Even if it were free, in my mind, I think, even if it were free of partisanship in the sense of Democrat, Republican, there still would exist within that organization the same type of dynamics that produces a leader who then makes the appointments. The sort of rank and file relinquish some of their authority to the leaders. And there's no reason to have a second group do that. We have a General Assembly. People may be very dissatisfied, but the fact is that there's much more opportunity during the general elections, and we know what we have. With the Constitutional Convention, we don't know what we would have, but we have a pretty good example of what we could have, and that's what convinces me that we shouldn't take that chance again.
So what do you say to the people? It's the last chance for the people to have some effect on their governance. That the current General Assembly is so restricted by the leadership. That maybe a bunch of delegates who don't owe anything to the leaders could do something.
Lila says sort of something changed them, and I'm saying that a better balance at the ballot box, and it's the citizens of Rhode Island who are responsible for that. So you can point all your fingers at elected officials, but then it goes right back to the citizenry who continually to elect the same folks over and over again and not do due diligence in looking for people who have good public policy as a prime motivation for being there.
But the structure of the General Assembly is such that even if good people get up there, they become overwhelmed by the top-heavy directions from leadership.
Good leadership. We need leadership. Everybody needs leadership, but we want to have good leadership that is thinking not of special interests, but thinking of the people's interests. I want to say one more thing for those of you who are idealists about a constitutional convention. I do believe we could have a people's constitutional convention. A constitutional convention where the delegates were responsible and accountable only to the people. But in order to do that, this is what we would have to do, and you tell me whether you think it's possible. First of all, delegates would have to run statewide, not from districts. Secondly, delegates would have to agree among themselves to take a very limited amount of money, to spend a very limited amount of money on their campaigns. Third, delegates would have to, I'm just trying to think, there were two more things that I had decided delegates would have to do in order to be perfectly accountable to only the people. I know. They would have to get at least 500 signatures on their nomination papers statewide. You know, if you think about that, do you think that we could ever get a constitutional convention that was composed of people who had been elected in that way? I don't think so. I think that is kind of a hopeless hope, and therefore I think we have to work with what we have. And as I say, what we have is a General Assembly that is perfectly capable of attending to the reforms that we need, and we should give them the tools to do it by electing better people.
Those in favor of a constitutional convention kind of say that the portrayal of this side is that leave it to the professionals. Like, it's kind of like we're the elected officials, we know what we're doing, and this kind of, in a way, kind of accentuates that. Is this kind of just like up to just let the elected delegates be the ones to make it?
You're making it overly simplistic. It isn't just leaving it to what you refer to as the professionals. Within that General Assembly, there are lots of good people. There are people like a Lila Sappinsley, like a Mike Lanahan, and it could go on and name many, many more that are really interested in good public policy. And there are ways working within that structure that, in spite of leadership and with the help of leadership, that you can do some very good things with public policy. Separation of powers, we keep going back to that. That's a good example. And there are many others in terms of just public policy issues that are not necessarily constitutional issues, but very much impact the lives of children and families and Rhode Islanders generally. I worked on bills that I think were really good pieces of legislation. They took me upwards. Lead legislation took me upwards of 9 years of going back and forth and dealing with special interests, dealing with leadership issues. If you're persistent and you can prove yourself and you can get there, things can get done. So it isn't quite that simple.
And I guess to kind of piggyback off of Bill, with everyone saying with the civil rights being taken away, 1986 compared to now, nearly 30 years in the future, one could make a case that ideals change, views change, public norm change, what's accepted socially changes. So are these civil liberties at risk as much as people think they could be, even with the 30-year generation gap, with a younger generation coming up?
I know I frequently go to the State House to testify in favor of good bills that affect certain minority groups and against, and most often against some very bad bills. I mean, look at immigration, for example. Every year there are half a dozen bills to restrict the rights of immigrants, whether it's to rent apartments to them, to allow them to drive cars, to obtain driver's licenses, or to work. So you know, there is an ongoing year, and maybe there's an ongoing effort to restrict civil rights. Yes, some of those issues may change from year to year, but there is, you can always find that there's an effort to restrict rights, and while those may change, you know, the beauty of the process of the General Assembly process is that, you know, we have a three-branch government, three branches of government. So there's checks and balances. So, you know, first of all, the House and the Senate both have to agree and pass measures after committee process. And yes, that can be frustrating. And I understand how the public in Rhode Island has become frustrated. But the public should not allow that frustration to become desperation and to throw it all into this constitutional convention process that we know from past experience doesn't work. If a bill passes and it's a bad bill, well then the governor can, you know, we have veto power. And then we have the courts that, they can find a law unconstitutional. There is very little of that in the Constitutional Convention. I mean, the only way that a bad bill that comes out of the convention can be undone is by a federal court finding that it's unconstitutional against the U.S. Constitution. So the protections are not there. So this process of the convention, it's a very strong process. Someone called it, the General Assembly on steroids, and I think that's an accurate description.
Anything else?
Thank you very much for coming.